Elena Carter had been inside Brookhaven House for less than 3 minutes when the billionaire she had been hired to nurse looked down from the staircase and told her that her mother had died because of him. Nathan Brooks did not raise his voice, yet the sentence traveled through the marble foyer with enough force to silence the house staff and stop Samuel Whitaker's hand midway toward Elena's suitcase. Snowmelt darkened the shoulders of Elena's coat. Her pulse beat painfully beneath her jaw, and the employment contract inside her bag suddenly felt less like an opportunity than evidence in a decision someone else had made for her. 3 years had passed since Grace Carter died from cancer in a Chicago hospital, with Elena holding one hand and believing she understood every important chapter of her mother's life. Now a stranger with tired eyes, an old scar near his temple, and more money than anyone Elena had ever treated, was claiming responsibility for a death he could not possibly have caused. Before Elena could demand an explanation, Nathan added, "If I am wrong, you can leave tonight. But if I am right, someone brought you here to finish what your mother started." Samuel asked Nathan to stop, not with the obedience of an employee, but with the firmness of a man who had corrected him before. Nathan ignored him and descended slowly, favoring his left leg in a way the medical file had failed to mention, then stopped several feet from Elena without offering his hand. His gaze moved across her face, as though searching for a resemblance he had prepared himself to find. Yet what Elena saw in him was not recognition, guilt, or grief alone. It was suspicion. "You requested me by name," she said, keeping her voice controlled, because anger became most useful when it was given structure. Nathan answered that he had requested Elena after receiving an envelope written by Grace, although the envelope arrived 2 years after her funeral and contained instructions nobody could explain. Elena told him that grief did not grant permission to invent relationships with the dead, and Nathan accepted the accusation with an unsettling lack of defense. "I do not expect you to trust me," he said. "I am not certain I trust the version of myself that remembers her." That answer disturbed Elena more than a confident lie would have, because Nathan spoke like a patient, describing symptoms rather than a powerful man presenting a mystery for entertainment. Samuel led them into a smaller sitting room, where a fire burned beneath a stone mantel, and family photographs crowded every table with the ordinary happiness wealth could not manufacture. Elena removed her coat but remained standing, while Nathan lowered himself into a chair and pressed 2 fingers against his left temple until the tremor in his hand passed. His medical record listed chronic pain, insomnia, and post-traumatic memory disruption after a car crash 6 years earlier, yet it omitted the medications she now recognized on the side table beside him. 2 were appropriate, 1 was outdated, and a 4th bottle carried no prescribing physician's name. Elena picked it up before asking permission, then discovered the tablets inside did not match the label. Nathan watched her examine them and asked whether she had found something wrong, but Samuel answered first. "Those arrived from Dr. Mercer's office yesterday, exactly as they always do." Nathan's expression hardened at the mention of Mercer, then softened so quickly Elena wondered whether she had imagined it. Dr. Daniel Mercer was not listed in the medical folder, although Samuel described him as Nathan's godfather, former family physician, and chairman of the Brooks Foundation, a man trusted by 3 generations. Elena asked why a retired physician was supplying unmarked medication to a patient with a traumatic brain injury, and Samuel said Mercer claimed the pharmacy had changed manufacturers. Nathan insisted the pills reduced his episodes, although he admitted he had no memory of taking them during the first 4 years after the accident. Elena refused to discuss Grace until the medication could be verified, which irritated Nathan enough to pull the bottle from her hand. "You arrived because of my mother's letter, not because my dosage offended you," he said, and Elena answered that he hired a nurse, not a witness he could position where he wanted. Their eyes held for several seconds, both recognizing the same dangerous truth. Neither of them had invited the other into their lives freely. Nathan led Elena to the library only after she threatened to contact the licensing board about the medication, and the decision looked less like surrender than a calculated exchange. He unlocked a cabinet beside the fireplace and removed a wooden box wrapped with a black ribbon, then placed it on the table without opening it. Inside were 3 sealed envelopes, a faded photograph, and a brass key attached to a paper tag bearing Grace's handwriting. Elena recognized the slant of the letters immediately, along with a tiny ink blot near the word daughter, a flaw caused by the fountain pen Grace used only for private letters. Nathan explained that the box had remained with a law firm for years, under instructions to deliver it when he hired Elena willingly, not when she was contacted, pressured, or offered money directly. Elena asked how Grace could have predicted that exact arrangement, and Nathan said he had spent 2 years asking the same question. "There is one more condition," he added. "You must choose which envelope to open first, and one of them contains a lie my family has protected for 15 years. Elena looked at the envelopes, each marked only with a word. One said Nathan, one said Elena, and one said truth. She asked what happened if she chose incorrectly, and Nathan admitted the letter from the attorney warned that the order mattered because someone inside Brookhaven would destroy the remaining evidence after the first seal was broken. Samuel objected that nobody on the estate would betray the family, yet Nathan turned toward him with pain so familiar that Elena understood the argument had occurred before. "Loyalty is not proof of innocence," Nathan said. "Sometimes it is only the reason a person survives questioning." Elena studied the room, the old photographs, the locked cabinets, the medication bottle, and the man whose distrust seemed broad enough to include himself. Then she reached for the envelope marked Nathan, because Grace had taught her that the most dangerous truth was often the one people believed belonged to someone else. Before she could break the seal, the lights went out, glass shattered somewhere above them, and a woman screamed from the eastern hallway that the locked room had been opened. Elena slipped the unopened envelope into her coat pocket before Nathan could object, then followed the scream into the darkened corridor with Samuel close behind them. Emergency lights flickered along the floor, illuminating Margaret Lane, Brookhaven's longtime housekeeper, standing beside an oak door that Samuel claimed had remained sealed since Grace's final visit 15 years earlier. The lock hung broken from the frame, splinters covered the carpet, and cold air entered through an open window at the far end of the room. Someone had searched the shelves, overturned 2 filing cabinets, and removed a rectangular object from a dustless space on the central table. Nathan moved toward the window, but Elena caught his arm because the drop below exceeded 20 feet, and fresh snow made the stone ledge nearly invisible. He pulled away, accusing her of treating him like a child, while Elena reminded him that anger did not make gravity negotiable. The sharpness between them startled Margaret, but Samuel looked almost relieved, perhaps because someone had finally challenged Nathan without fear or inheritance complicating the response. Security found no intruder, no footprints beneath the window, and no damage to the locked service entrance connecting the room to a narrow staircase. Nathan concluded the search had been staged by someone already inside Brookhaven, then demanded that every employee remain on the property until police arrived. Elena objected immediately, explaining that confinement would turn loyal staff into suspects while giving the guilty person time to coordinate a story. Nathan accused her of protecting people she had met minutes earlier, and Elena asked whether suspicion had become his only remaining form of control. The question struck harder than she intended, because Nathan's face closed before he answered. Control is what people call caution, when the person exercising it owns the building. Elena told him wealth was irrelevant to bad judgment, then walked back toward the library with his anger following her in silence. She had expected arrogance from Nathan Brooks, but what unsettled her was the way he used intelligence to defend fear after fear had already made the decision. The envelope marked Nathan contained 4 handwritten pages from Grace, yet the first sentence undermined everything Elena had assumed. Grace wrote that Nathan should not be blamed for what happened at the lake because he had tried to stop it and paid for that decision with 6 missing years of his own life. She warned, however, that his memory would return in fragments shaped by medication, guilt, and information fed to him by others. Nathan read over Elena's shoulder despite her objection, then stopped when Grace described a man who would present himself as protector, physician, and victim, while quietly deciding which truths Nathan was stable enough to hear. The description seemed aimed directly at Daniel Mercer, which made the answer feel too convenient. Elena noticed Nathan wanted it to be true, not because he hated Mercer, but because suspicion offered relief from blaming himself. She folded the letter and said they needed evidence independent of Grace's opinion, a statement Nathan interpreted as disrespect toward a dead woman he appeared to defend more fiercely than Elena did. Their argument sharpened when Nathan claimed Grace trusted him with Elena's future, while Elena replied that her mother had no right to assign her daughter to a stranger after death. Nathan said Grace never assigned anything, then admitted he had paid Elena's nursing agency an additional fee to ensure she received no competing offers that month. Elena stared at him, understanding that her financial choice had been manipulated before she made it. Nathan justified the decision by saying time was limited. Mercer's control over the foundation was increasing, and Grace's instructions required Elena's voluntary arrival. Voluntary means informed, Elena said. It does not mean arranging my circumstances until I choose what you wanted. Nathan's shame appeared briefly, then hardened into defensiveness as he argued that no harm had been done. Elena told him the sentence sounded exactly like something powerful men said when consequences belong to someone else. She packed her suitcase before midnight and informed Samuel she would leave as soon as the roads cleared. Nathan did not ask her to stay, which disappointed Elena more than persuasion would have. Instead, he placed the remaining envelopes in the estate safe and said she could take Grace's letter, the medication bottle, and copies of any records relevant to her mother. His restraint felt honorable until Elena discovered her car would not start and the battery cable had been deliberately cut. Nathan assumed someone wanted to prevent both of them from leaving, yet Elena suspected he had ordered the damage and challenged him in front of Samuel. Nathan's anger finally escaped its polished boundaries, and he accused her of judging him through the worst examples of wealthy men before learning anything he had survived. Elena answered that survival did not exempt anyone from becoming harmful, then watched his expression collapse around a truth he already knew. Before either could speak again, Margaret entered carrying an old answering machine recovered from the locked room. The tape inside contained a message recorded by Grace during Elena's childhood, and in the background a younger Nathan could be heard begging someone named Thomas not to tell Elena what her mother had done. The message lasted less than 40 seconds, but it changed the direction of every suspicion inside Brookhaven. Grace instructed Margaret to hide a key inside the grandfather clock if Nathan ever brought Elena to the estate, then warned that Thomas Reed would be blamed for crimes committed by someone the Brooks family considered incapable of betrayal. A second voice interrupted her, male and frightened, saying Nathan had seen the transfer records and wanted to confess everything. Then Nathan's younger voice entered from farther away, pleading that Elena should never learn her mother had chosen the Brooks family over her own daughter. Present-day Nathan denied remembering the conversation, yet his face revealed something deeper than confusion. He remembered the accusation, if not the facts supporting it. Elena asked what Grace had chosen, and Nathan whispered that the answer might be why her mother spent the final years of her life watching Elena struggle financially while millions sat untouched in a trust bearing Grace's secret authorization. Elena slapped Nathan before she fully understood she intended to, and the sound echoed through the library with an intimacy more painful than violence. Nathan did not touch his face or ask Samuel to intervene, which made Elena's anger feel suddenly directionless, yet she refused to apologize while he was suggesting Grace had abandoned her daughter to protect a billionaire family. Nathan said the trust had funded clinics, scholarships, and legal aid, but Grace could have drawn income from it at any time and never did. Elena remembered unpaid bills hidden inside kitchen drawers, reused winter coats, and nights when Grace worked double shifts despite chemotherapy, then felt betrayal searching for a shape large enough to hold those memories. She accused Nathan of turning generosity into another story wealthy people told about poor women who suffered beautifully. Nathan answered that he had spent years trying to give Grace credit, only to discover she had legally prohibited her name from appearing. Elena told him credit was not the issue, because dignity meant little when a child watched her mother choose strangers again and again. The argument ended when Samuel unlocked the grandfather clock and found a brass key taped beneath the pendulum, exactly where Grace's recording predicted. The key opened a drawer hidden behind the bottom shelf of the locked room, revealing financial ledgers, hospital records, and a photograph of Grace standing beside Thomas Reed, Eleanor Brooks, Nathan's father, and Daniel Mercer. The image appeared ordinary until Elena noticed everyone looked toward the camera except Grace, whose attention remained fixed on Nathan outside the frame. On the back, Grace had written a date from 15 years earlier and one sentence: Nathan told the truth, but nobody believed him because Daniel made certain the truth sounded like panic. Nathan's hands shook as he read it. Then he admitted Mercer began treating him for anxiety when he was 28, shortly after Nathan confronted his father about suspicious transfers. The medication made him sleep, forget conversations, and doubt whether arguments occurred as he remembered them. Yet every physician consulted afterward relied on Mercer's records. Elena examined the old prescriptions and discovered the pattern was more complicated than simple poisoning. Mercer had prescribed legitimate medications at defensible dosages, but he changed combinations whenever Nathan began questioning financial decisions, creating side effects severe enough to resemble emotional instability. The evidence suggested manipulation, yet it also showed Nathan had episodes before Mercer treated him, including a violent confrontation with his father that injured a security guard. Nathan insisted he had been trying to stop the guard from destroying records, while Samuel confirmed the man later received a settlement and disappeared. Elena refused to accept Nathan's memory as fact, simply because Mercer now appeared suspicious, and Nathan accused her of protecting uncertainty, because certainty might make Grace's choices harder to forgive. Their conflict no longer concerned evidence alone. Elena feared becoming another person asked to excuse everything in the name of a dead woman's courage, while Nathan feared that if Grace had not believed him, then no trustworthy version of his past remained. The ledgers implicated Daniel Mercer in hidden transfers, but several authorizations carried Grace's signature, witnessed by Thomas Reed. Nathan seized on them as proof Grace had been forced, while Elena noticed the signatures matched her mother's precisely, and included handwritten corrections only Grace would make. Thomas appeared less like an innocent whistleblower and more like a partner in the transactions, which meant the obvious villain might have been chosen for them too early. Samuel reluctantly revealed that Thomas and Grace had been romantically involved before Elena was born, although Grace later denied he was Elena's father. Nathan had known only fragments, because Eleanor forbade discussion after Thomas vanished and Grace left Brookhaven permanently. Elena felt the room tilt beneath her as family history, financial crime, and private grief collapsed into one another. She asked Samuel why he had remained silent, and he answered that Grace made him promise never to reveal Thomas without evidence that he survived. Elena said promises were becoming a convenient language for cowardice, then left the room before Samuel could defend himself. In Grace's medical records, Elena found repeated payments from the secret trust to a clinic in rural Tennessee, where a physician named Thomas Lane had worked under restricted credentials for nearly 14 years. The dates aligned with Thomas Reed's disappearance, yet the clinic had received money authorized jointly by Grace and Daniel Mercer. If Mercer wanted Thomas silenced, funding his work made little sense unless the payments purchased obedience. Nathan proposed traveling there immediately, but Elena refused to accompany him until he disclosed everything he remembered about the lake. After several minutes, Nathan admitted he had met Grace there 6 years earlier because she planned to expose Mercer, Thomas, and Nathan's father together. He remembered Grace entering a boat with Thomas, remembered Mercer arriving afterward, and remembered choosing to follow in his car rather than calling police. He also remembered shouting that Grace had destroyed Elena's chance at a normal life, the same accusation captured on the childhood recording. "I hated her for making me responsible for you," he said. "Then my car went over the guardrail, and everyone decided guilt was the only part of that night worth preserving." Elena asked whether he believed Grace caused the crash, and Nathan said he had once believed she arranged it to protect Thomas. He had later convinced himself Mercer was responsible, because that version allowed Grace to remain brave and Thomas to remain innocent. Neither version explained why Grace continued writing to him for years afterward, nor why she delayed bringing Elena to Brookhaven until after her death. The unresolved contradiction became the first thing they truly agreed upon. Someone had not merely hidden evidence, Someone had designed multiple believable stories so every survivor would distrust the others. Elena decided they would go to Tennessee, but only after she copied every file, contacted an independent attorney, and arranged automatic release if either disappeared. Nathan accepted the conditions, then handed her the second envelope marked Elena. Inside, Grace had written only one page. The final line said, "Do not let Nathan make me innocent, and do not let your pain make me guilty, because both mistakes would protect the man who loved us enough to ruin everyone." The drive into Tennessee took nearly 3 hours through wet mountain roads, during which Elena and Nathan spoke only when practical decisions required it. Silence exposed details argument had hidden, including Nathan's habit of rubbing the scar at his temple before answering questions, and Elena's tendency to reread Grace's letter whenever anger threatened certainty. At a roadside diner, Nathan ordered coffee but did not drink it, then admitted Grace had once brought him there after a board meeting where his father publicly humiliated him. Elena asked why Grace cared about a young executive from the family she accused of corruption, and Nathan answered that she believed people became dangerous when nobody challenged the version of themselves built by shame. The sentence sounded like Grace, but it also sounded rehearsed by someone who had spent years turning her into a moral compass. Elena told Nathan he did not love Grace as a person, because he loved the clarity she represented. Nathan replied that Elena resented Grace for being admired by strangers, because private suffering rarely received witnesses. Thomas Lane directed the rural clinic from a converted schoolhouse surrounded by winter fields, and the man waiting inside looked older than the photograph but unmistakably familiar to Elena. He did not embrace her, apologize, or ask whether Grace had spoken of him. He simply said, "You have her eyes when you are deciding not to believe someone," then invited them into an office where a broken radiator clicked beneath the window. Thomas admitted he was Thomas Reed, had signed the transfers, and had helped Grace move money through offshore accounts. He refused, however, to call the transactions theft. Nathan's father and Mercer had hidden losses that would collapse the company, destroy employee pensions, and trigger criminal investigations affecting innocent subsidiaries. Grace proposed moving private family assets into a trust before regulators froze everything, then using those funds to compensate employees and preserve community clinics. The plan was illegal, ethically compromised, and designed under pressure. Yet Thomas insisted it prevented thousands of families from losing everything, while the guilty men negotiated immunity. Elena asked why Grace never told her, and Thomas answered with a cruelty rooted in honesty rather than malice. "Because you were the one person whose love she could not survive losing." Grace had already become pregnant when the crisis began, although Thomas said he was not Elena's father and refused to identify the man without Grace's permission. She believed public exposure would make Elena's childhood inseparable from scandal, while silence allowed Grace to raise her away from Brookhaven. Mercer agreed to the trust because it protected the company and his reputation, but he later tried to control its investments and discovered Grace had divided authority among several people. Nathan's father wanted the entire arrangement buried, while Eleanor Brooks supported Grace and forced the family to honor the restitution plan. Thomas vanished after someone forged evidence linking him to stolen funds, and Grace helped him escape because prosecutors appeared compromised. Nathan accused him of abandoning Grace, but Thomas said he left only after Nathan personally warned that Mercer intended to have him arrested before morning. Nathan denied remembering any warning, and Thomas produced a voicemail recorded the night before his disappearance. Nathan's younger voice sounded panicked but coherent, instructing Thomas to leave through the Eastern Service Road and trust nobody inside Brookhaven, including Grace. The message ended with Nathan saying Grace had changed the agreement and planned to tell Elena the truth when she turned 18. Nathan closed his eyes, then recalled finding Grace and Mercer arguing about Elena's future beside the lake. Mercer wanted silence preserved, while Grace believed secrecy was becoming another harm. Nathan had chosen Grace's side, which triggered the confrontation leading to his later treatment and isolation. Thomas then revealed the most destabilizing truth. Mercer had not conceived the cover-up, and Nathan's father had not controlled its most violent decisions. Eleanor Brooks, Nathan's revered grandmother, had ordered Thomas's false criminal file, pressured Grace into silence, and authorized Mercer to manage Nathan's memory because she believed protecting the family required controlling everyone who might expose it. The revelation fractured Nathan more deeply than proof against Mercer ever could, because Eleanor had raised him after his mother died and represented the only unconditional love he remembered. Thomas said Mercer initially opposed medicating Nathan, arguing that treatment without informed consent would repeat the company's abuses, but Eleanor threatened to expose Mercer's own role in the financial transfers. Over time, Mercer embraced the control he first accepted reluctantly, eventually convincing himself that every manipulation prevented a greater collapse. He monitored Grace, protected Thomas's clinic, and altered Nathan's medications, sometimes saving them from discovery and sometimes destroying their autonomy. Elena finally understood Grace's final line about the man who loved them enough to ruin everyone. Mercer's motive was not greed alone. He loved Eleanor, considered Nathan his son, admired Grace, and believed truth was a luxury families could afford, only after danger passed. The tragedy was that danger never passed for a man who needed protection to justify his importance. Thomas agreed to testify, but insisted they first recover Eleanor's original directives, which Grace hid somewhere at Brookhaven after refusing to destroy them. Before they could leave, Daniel Mercer entered the clinic alone, without security or threat, carrying a portable oxygen tank and looking 20 years older than the polished photograph in the estate. He revealed that he had advanced pulmonary fibrosis and likely months to live. Nathan accused him of arranging the crash, but Mercer answered that he arrived afterward and pulled Nathan from the vehicle before calling for help anonymously. The crash had been caused by Nathan's father, who followed him from Brookhaven and forced his car off the road to stop him reaching federal investigators. Mercer covered that truth, because Nathan's father died weeks later, and exposing him would have destroyed Eleanor during her final illness. Then Mercer looked at Elena and said Grace's cancer treatment had been paid through the trust, not because she lacked insurance, but because she refused to use money Eleanor offered personally. "Your mother did not die poor," he said. "She died making certain every dollar left behind belonged to people whose names nobody powerful would remember." Elena wanted to hate Mercer cleanly, but his failing breath, careful honesty, and refusal to excuse himself made hatred feel more demanding than she expected. He admitted switching Nathan's medications, leaking concerns about his competence, and manipulating the nursing agency so Elena would arrive before Nathan's birthday, transferred control of the trust. He also admitted cutting Elena's battery cable, though not to imprison her. Someone else had entered Brookhaven that night searching for Eleanor's directives, and Mercer feared Elena would leave with Grace's envelope before understanding its danger. Nathan asked why Mercer had not simply told the truth, and Mercer smiled with exhausted sadness. "Because every time I told part of it, I was rewarded for choosing which part another person could survive." His justification carried the intelligence of a man who had practiced it for decades. Elena told him he had mistaken dependency for love, then watched the words land without resistance. Mercer offered to surrender records proving Eleanor's role, but only if Thomas agreed to destroy documents linking Grace to the illegal transfers. Thomas refused, arguing that clearing Grace by erasing her choices would repeat the same violence in a kinder form. Elena agreed, despite knowing public disclosure might reduce her mother's reputation from saint to compromised participant. Nathan resisted, insisting Grace had acted under coercion and deserved protection from people who would simplify moral complexity into scandal. Elena accused him of needing Grace to remain pure because his own recovery depended on believing someone had seen him clearly. Nathan accused Elena of punishing Grace for dying before they could argue honestly. The conflict became personal enough to wound them both, yet neither withdrew because love, grief, and truth had finally become inseparable. Mercer listened until his breathing worsened, then said Grace anticipated the disagreement and placed final authority with Elena alone. Back at Brookhaven, they found Margaret injured near the eastern stairwell and Samuel missing. Security footage showed Samuel entering Eleanor's former bedroom with the final envelope, then leaving through a service tunnel built during Prohibition. Nathan concluded Samuel had betrayed them, while Elena remembered Grace's warning to judge people by what they protected when protection cost them something. Samuel had maintained the locked room, hidden the clock key, and preserved records for decades. Yet loyalty did not eliminate the possibility that his loyalty belonged to Eleanor's memory rather than Grace's truth. They followed the tunnel to the boathouse, where Samuel stood beside a metal furnace holding Eleanor's directives over an open flame. Nathan ordered him to stop, but Samuel said Eleanor had raised him from poverty, educated his children, and trusted him with her final request. He believed destroying the documents would allow Grace's restitution work to survive without scandal and prevent thousands of beneficiaries from losing public trust. Elena asked whether Eleanor ever apologized for manipulating Nathan, framing Thomas, or silencing Grace. Samuel said she regretted the pain but believed history would judge outcomes rather than methods. Nathan laughed bitterly, recognizing the same argument Mercer had used, the same argument Grace partly accepted, and the same argument he had used when manipulating Elena's employment. The family's true inheritance was not wealth, but the belief that good intentions authorized hidden decisions. Samuel's hand shook above the furnace, as he admitted Eleanor also knew Nathan's father caused the crash and ordered Mercer to conceal it. She feared Nathan would expose his father before dying, leaving the Brooks name defined by one violent act rather than generations of work. Nathan told Samuel to burn the documents if preserving Eleanor mattered more than preserving him. Elena heard not surrender, but a child's final test of whether love would choose his pain over someone else's image. Samuel lowered the papers without releasing them, then confessed that Grace had visited him shortly before her death and asked him to choose differently when the time came. He had agreed, yet loyalty became harder once the moment demanded betraying the woman who had saved his family. Elena stepped closer and said Grace had not asked him to betray Eleanor, only to stop forcing the living to carry consequences the dead avoided. Samuel gave her the directives and began crying with the quiet humiliation of someone whose moral certainty had outlived its usefulness. Inside the final envelope, Grace described Eleanor with gratitude, anger, and compassion, refusing to reduce her to villain or benefactor. Eleanor had protected employees, funded restitution, and prevented immediate collapse, but she also sacrificed individual lives to preserve the future she valued. Grace wrote that mercy without accountability became permission, while accountability without mercy became revenge. The final directive required a public disclosure of every participant's role, including Grace's, followed by restitution governed by people harmed rather than families responsible. Nathan feared the company would fall. Thomas feared the clinic would close. Samuel feared Eleanor's name would be destroyed, and Mercer feared Grace's work would disappear beneath scandal. Elena faced the choice her mother had postponed for years. She could protect Grace's reputation and preserve the trust quietly, or expose the complete truth and risk everything the trust supported. Rather than decide alone, she invited employees, clinic representatives, scholarship recipients, pension holders, and independent legal experts to review the evidence under confidentiality. Nathan objected that outsiders lacked context, and Elena answered that context had become the family's favorite method of keeping power. The people who paid for these decisions deserve more than whatever version makes us easiest to forgive. The disclosure meeting lasted 9 hours, and nobody left feeling that justice had arrived in a form clean enough to celebrate. Retired employees learned their pensions had been preserved through illegal transfers, but also that executives concealed losses while workers carried the risk. Clinic directors discovered Grace had secured their funding through coercion and secrecy, while families who benefited from the trust refused to call her criminal or saint. Nathan listened as strangers debated whether his family's restitution repaired harm or merely purchased time, and for the first time he did not control the room's interpretation. Elena watched him absorb criticism without retreating into illness, wealth, or inherited shame. That endurance became more convincing than any declaration of recovery. Mercer attended by video from the hospital, admitting his actions without requesting sympathy, while Thomas authenticated the ledgers and Samuel testified about Eleanor's directives. The company survived, though not unchanged. Nathan resigned as sole chairman, created an independent oversight board with employee and community representation, and authorized direct compensation funded partly through the sale of family assets. The Brooks name was removed from several buildings, while Grace's name was not added despite public pressure to honor her. Elena insisted her mother's legacy remain in the work rather than become another brand polished beyond truth. Thomas was legally cleared but chose to keep the name Lane, explaining that innocence restored by paperwork did not erase the life he built while hiding. Samuel retired from estate management, then volunteered at the clinic twice a month, where people valued his work without requiring loyalty to anyone's memory. Margaret remained at Brookhaven and stopped pretending cinnamon rolls could solve grief, though she continued baking them whenever difficult meetings ran late. Mercer died 4 months after the inquiry began, but before his death he asked Elena to visit without Nathan. He confessed that Grace had loved him once, not romantically, but with the trust reserved for someone believed capable of becoming better. He had mistaken that faith for permanent forgiveness and spent years protecting people because he feared losing the role that made him necessary. Elena asked whether he regretted manipulating Nathan, and Mercer said regret was too comfortable because it centered his pain. "I regret that I kept calling it love after love stopped asking what he wanted." He gave Elena a final recording Grace had made during treatment, then asked her not to play it until she could hear her mother without needing innocence or blame. Elena did not forgive him, but she held his hand when breathing became difficult, because compassion did not require rewriting what someone had done. Grace's recording remained unopened until spring, when white dogwood blossoms appeared across the hillside above Brookhaven. Elena sat beneath the oldest tree with Nathan nearby, neither of them speaking because silence had become less threatening after they stopped using it as protection. Grace's voice emerged thin but steady, beginning not with explanation but apology. She told Elena she had hidden Brookhaven because she feared her daughter would judge every sacrifice by the pain it caused at home. She admitted choosing the trust, choosing Thomas's safety, choosing Nathan's future, and sometimes choosing strangers when Elena needed her. "I told myself you were strong enough to understand later," Grace said. "But children should never be required to become strong so adults can postpone honesty." Elena covered her mouth as the words dismantled the defense she had expected and delivered the truth she had never allowed herself to request. Grace said she loved her daughter more than any cause. Yet love did not prevent cowardice, pride, or the belief that suffering privately made choices noble. She asked Elena not to inherit her habit of leaving people protected but uninformed. Then Grace addressed Nathan, telling him he was not responsible for saving Elena, the company, or the memory of anyone who failed him. She apologized for making him a guardian because she feared death more than she admitted. "You were a young man asking adults to tell the truth," she said, "and we rewarded your courage by teaching you to doubt your own mind." Nathan lowered his head, and the sob that escaped him carried 6 years of fear without dignity or explanation. Elena moved beside him, not as his nurse or Grace's daughter, but as someone finally able to witness pain without turning it into a duty. Nathan said he had spent years believing recovery would arrive when every memory became certain. Elena told him certainty had become another locked room, and perhaps healing meant living honestly even when parts of the past remained unanswered. He asked whether she could forgive Grace, and Elena said forgiveness was not a door she could walk through once. Some days she admired her mother, some days she resented her, and both feelings belonged inside love. Nathan admitted he still loved Eleanor, despite knowing what she had done. Elena answered that mature love did not require pretending harm came from strangers. The recording ended with Grace describing a packet of dogwood seeds hidden beneath the bench. Elena found them wrapped in the same black ribbon that once marked danger throughout Brookhaven. Grace explained that the ribbon had never symbolized death, as Nathan believed, but unfinished work requiring someone's attention. Elena untied it, poured half the seeds into Nathan's palm, and kept the rest. Together they planted them along the slope above the lake, leaving enough distance between each seedling for roots to grow without competing for the same ground. Nathan asked whether Elena planned to stay after her nursing contract ended. She said she would leave for Chicago, help her brother graduate, and return only if returning remained her choice, rather than anyone's promise. Months later, Elena came back to Brookhaven as co-director of the Independent Care Trust, not because Grace arranged it, but because the work had become meaningful after Truth removed the debt hidden inside it. Nathan greeted her at the door without staff, contracts, or explanations prepared in advance. The house still contained locked cabinets, family portraits, and memories nobody could fully repair. Yet its silence no longer felt guarded. Elena paused beside the staircase, where Nathan had once blamed himself for her mother's death, then noticed a new photograph on the wall. It showed employees, patients, trustees, and families standing together outside the rural clinic, without any billionaire placed at the center. That evening, Elena walked to the lake alone and tied the final length of black ribbon around a young dogwood tree. She thought of Grace, Eleanor, Mercer, Thomas, Samuel, Nathan, and herself, each person capable of generosity and damage, sometimes within the same choice. The lesson was not that truth always saved people, because truth had cost them money, status, certainty, and several beloved illusions. The lesson was that hidden harm grew interest, passing quietly from one generation to the next until someone agreed to pay the emotional debt in full. Elena turned toward Brookhaven as warm lights appeared in the windows and understood that a happy ending did not erase what happened. It simply began when people stopped demanding innocence before choosing repair.